Jack's hands were not the same hands anymore. He noticed it the morning the last wall went up, standing in the doorway of the finished house, looking at his own palms. The skin was thick now, calloused in the specific places that come from carrying timber and laying brick and gripping a wheelbarrow handle for months without stopping. The kind of hands that belong to a man who builds things. 2 years ago, these hands had signed bankruptcy papers. He had sat in a lawyer's office in the city and signed his name on document after document and watched everything he had spent 8 years building become a list of assets to be divided and settled and closed. The office had been very clean. The chairs were ergonomic. Someone had put a glass of water in front of him that he never touched. He had driven home from that office and sat in the parking lot of his building for 40 minutes. Then he had called Tu Tien. She had answered on the second ring. "I know," she said, before he said anything. "Come home." The land had cost almost nothing because it was worth almost nothing. Dry soil, no electricity, no running water, a single concrete post at the edge of the road that had once held a gate for a farm that had failed before theirs. Jack had stood on it the first afternoon and turned in a slow circle and tried to see what it could become instead of what it was. "There," Tu Tien said. She was pointing at a rise in the ground near the eastern edge. "The house goes there. The morning light will hit it first. We don't have money for a house yet." "I know." She lowered her hand. "But it goes there." He had learned by then not to argue with the way Tu Tien pointed at things. The first night they slept on the ground under a plastic sheet stretched between two posts. The sky was very clear, the kind of clear you only get far from city lights, where the stars are not decoration but presence, thick and close and indifferent in the way of things that have been there longer than any problem you are currently having. Tu Tien built a small fire from branches she had collected before dark. She had collected them without mentioning she was going to. By the time Jack realized what she was doing, the fire was already going. "You planned for this?" he said. "I planned for the first night being cold." She sat down beside the fire. "I did not plan for everything. Just the first night." Jack sat beside her. The fire was small. The land was dark in every direction. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a frog was making noise about something. "Tu Tien." "Yes." "I'm sorry." She looked at the fire for a moment. Then she looked at him. "For what?" "For this." He gestured at the darkness, at the plastic sheet, at the single concrete post. "This is not what I promised you." Tu Tien was quiet for a long time. "Jack," she said finally, "you did not promise me things. You promised me you." She picked up a stick and adjusted something in the fire. "I still have you. I don't understand what you're apologizing for." He did not have an answer for that. They sat by the fire until it went down to coals. Then they lay on the ground under the clear sky and did not sleep for a long time, and Jack stared at the stars and thought about the rise on the eastern edge of the land where Tu Tien had said the house would go. His mother came the third week. Jack had not asked her to come. She had simply appeared one morning with Dung's truck, a bag of food, and a set of tools she had borrowed from her brother. She had looked at the cleared ground and the stakes Jack had driven to mark the foundation, and said only, "The kitchen should face the field." "I know." Met. "And the bedroom window east." "I know." She had put her bag down and started cooking breakfast on the camp stove as if she had always planned to be there. Dung had gotten out of the truck and walked over to the foundation stakes and stood there looking at them for a long time with his hands in his pockets. "The timber," Dung said. "I know a man." "He owes me a favor from 1998. Dung turned around. "Let me call him." Jack looked at the older man. At the truck. At his mother stirring something over the camp stove as if this was completely normal. "Why are you both here?" Jack said. "Mrs." Lodi did not look up from the stove. "Because you are here," she said. "That is the only reason we need." The house took 4 months. Jack laid every brick in the foundation himself. He had watched tutorials at night on a phone with a cracked screen, learning the measurements, the ratios, the way mortar sets differently in humidity versus dry heat. He had made mistakes. He had corrected them. He had made different mistakes and corrected those too. Dung came every weekend. He brought timber and knowledge and a particular stubbornness about the right way to fit a roof beam that Jack had eventually stopped arguing with because Dung was always right. They worked in the early morning before the heat came, and in the late afternoon when it softened, and sometimes in the evening by lamplight when neither of them wanted to stop. Tu Tien worked alongside them. She mixed concrete. She measured twice before cutting anything. She made food that appeared at regular intervals without anyone asking for it, and she kept a notebook where she wrote down every material cost and every measurement and every change to the design, because someone had to remember everything. And Tu Tien had decided, without discussion, that the someone would be her. Mrs. Ly planted things. She started with a kitchen garden along the south wall, herbs first, then tomatoes, then the long beans Tu Tien had asked for. Then she moved to the area near the stone path and planted things that were not food but were necessary. A row of marigolds along the fence, a climbing vine over the gate, and at the eastern corner of the property, in the place she had chosen on the second day without telling anyone, a frangipani tree. She did not mention the frangipani to anyone. She simply planted it and watered it and waited. Dung had seen her do it. He had not said anything either, but the next morning he had arrived an hour earlier than usual, and he had worked without speaking all morning, and at lunch he had sat closer to her than he usually did. The house was finished on a Thursday, not dramatically, not with a ceremony or a celebration. Jack walked through the completed rooms in the early morning before anyone else was up and stood in each doorway for a moment. And the house was quiet and smelled of new wood and beeswax, and the particular clean smell of something that has been built carefully. The kitchen faced the field. The bedroom window faced east. The stone path wound through the garden to a small pond that caught the sky. Jack stood on the veranda and looked out at the farm, the vegetable rows, the fruit trees that were still small but would not always be small, the chicken coop Tu Tien had insisted on, the fish pond Dung had helped dig on a Saturday when it was too hot to do anything sensible. He looked at his hands, calloused, scarred in 2 places from accidents he had already forgotten. The kind of hands that belong to a man who builds things. 2 years ago, he had signed his name on papers that ended everything. He understood now that they had not ended everything. They had ended one version of everything. And the version that had come after was standing around him in every direct wood and stone and soil, and the sound of his mother humming in the kitchen and Tu Tien's footsteps on the stone path, and somewhere, from the room at the end of the hall, the small, insistent sound of a baby announcing that she was awake and the day could begin. Anna, 8 months old, named by Tu Tien on the second day after she was born, when Jack had asked what they should call her, and Tu Tien had said simply, "Something that sounds like a beginning." Jack went inside. He went to the room at the end of the hall. He lifted his daughter from the crib. She grabbed his finger with both hands the way she always did, the involuntary grip of someone who has decided this particular finger is worth holding on to. He stood by the east-facing window. The morning light came in. That evening, they ate dinner together, all of them, for the first time in the finished house. Mrs. Ly had cooked. Dung had brought rice wine from a neighbor who made it well. Tu Tien had picked the last of the garden herbs and added them to everything. Anna sat in the chair Tu Tien had rigged from a wooden crate and a cushion and ate rice porridge with the intense concentration of someone who had recently discovered that food was interesting. Nobody made a speech. There was no toast. They just ate. The way families eat when they are home, passing things without asking, refilling bowls without being told to, talking about the corn that needed fertilizing and the roof section that might need rechecking before the rainy season, and whether the fish in the pond were growing fast enough. Jack sat at the head of the table and looked at each of them in turn. Dung explaining something to Mrs. Lurdy about roof pitch. Mrs. Lurdy not listening to the explanation but listening to his voice. Tu Tien cutting Anna's food into smaller pieces while maintaining a separate conversation with Jack about the fruit trees. Anna watching the lamplight with the amber eyes she had inherited from a mountain she had never seen. This was what he had been building, not the house. The house was just the place it could happen. After dinner, when the dishes were done and Mrs. Ly and Dung had walked slowly out to the veranda and were sitting in the dark together, not saying much, Jack found Tu Tien in the kitchen. She was standing at the window looking out at the frangipani tree his mother had planted. Tu Tien. Yes. The first night. On the land, you had already decided. She turned from the window. In the lamplight, her face was the same face it had been that first evening by the fire, the same calm, the same certainty, the same particular quality of someone who had already done the difficult part of deciding and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. I decided before the first night, she said. When you called me from the parking lot. She looked at him. You didn't say anything. You just called and sat there. And I knew that whatever had happened, you needed someone on the other end of the line more than you needed words. She paused. I decided then. Jack was quiet for a moment. Outside on the veranda, his mother laughed at something Dung said. I never told you, Jack said, what it meant that you picked up. You didn't have to. I know. He looked at her. But I want to. I want to say it out loud in this house that we built, in this room that faces the field, in front of the window where your tree is. Tu Tien waited. Thank you, Jack said, for the second ring. Tu Tien looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the window. Outside, the frangipani tree was very still in the evening air, white flowers catching the last of the light. Go check on Anna, she said softly. He went. The house held all of them. The field stretched beyond. And somewhere on the eastern edge of the property, a tree that had been planted in faith was putting down roots in soil that had once been worth almost nothing and was now worth everything.